I've got passages to read from chapter 3 of The Haunted Self, the book on structural dissociation. This chapter is themed secondary structural dissociation, which is usually complex PTSD, but I learned in this chapter that it is not exclusive to that. Sometimes simple PTSD can be this. Like with primary structural dissociation, EPs in secondary structural dissociation are fixated on traumatic experiences and intrude on ANP with reactivated traumatic memories that may involve feelings, various sensory perceptions, or strongly held beliefs related to traumatizing events. In addition, many EPs related to childhood abuse and neglect have insecure patterns of attachment that alternate with or intrude on the attachment pattern of ANP, creating conflicting relational patterns known as disorganized or disoriented attachment. Those EPs developed in childhood may become more complex and autonomous than those developed in primary structural dissociation in adulthood. Their autonomy may allow them, at times, to completely dominate consciousness and behavior. However, the behaviors of these EPs are generally maladaptive in the present. Their core action tendencies are usually directed by specific subsystems of defense with respect to perceived bodily threat, especially threat from a person, examples flight, fight, and submission, rather than by the action systems of daily life and by overwhelming despair, rage, shame, childlike needs for care, and fear. They typically engage in primitive mental defensive action tendencies. Once more than a single EP develops, different aspects of one traumatic experience or different sets of traumatic experiences tend to be contained in various EPs. Each EP may be mediated by a particular animal defense-like subsystems, have specific insecure attachment styles, may engage in particular mental defense action tendencies, i.e., mental tendencies to cope with a variety of perceived inter- and intrapersonal threats, and may also be fixated in a particularly unbearable moment of the traumatic experience. That is called a pathogenic kernel. So if you're somebody with complex trauma or secondary structural dissociation and you feel like you have elements of anxious attachment and avoidant attachment, it might be that some of your EPs are anxiously attached and others are avoidantly attached, and that's how you end up with both. Secondary structural dissociation can have many different configurations of EPs, and each EP may have a varying degree of secondary elaboration and autonomy. In addition, the ANP of a survivor of chronic childhood relational traumatization is more likely to have maladaptive coping strategies than that of patients whose personality functioning was relatively intact prior to a single adult traumatic experience. Traumatic memories, and thus the EPs that contain them, may manifest in a stratified manner. When one layer of traumatic memory has been integrated, another layer may present itself, along with their attendant EPs. This succession is highly characteristic of patients with a history of chronic childhood abuse or neglect. Layering may also be related to different traumatic memories. Following completion of one traumatic memory, another traumatic memory comes forward along with different EPs. Each EP may be linked together in different ways. They may be chronological, following each other through time. That is, one EP follows another in time through a traumatic memory. Liani first processed a traumatic memory of being raped by her father at age 8 through one EP, and only afterwards another EP was activated that she had made an unaliving attempt after the rape because she erroneously believed that she had become pregnant. Other EPs may share a common emotional theme, such as rage or shame or sexual feelings. At times, a certain EP may be the sequential link among traumatic memories. For example, an EP that is sexualized may be present across time in several different experiences of sexual abuse. Finally, the link may be between an EP related to the original traumatic memory and an EP that holds an extremely upsetting fantasy or hallucination, which was evoked by the traumatic experience. In therapy, the experience of one or the other EP may come first. ANP uses EPs as mental protection, in that these EPs contain emotions, thoughts, fantasies, wishes, needs, and sensations that ANP believes to be unbearable or unacceptable. For example, extreme sadness and loneliness are often found in childlike EPs that also display freeze, flight, or submission. ANPs may disown dependency needs through EPs that are commonly fixed in the attachment cry and desperately seeking attachment. Parallel and sequential dissociation. More than one EP can simultaneously experience the same moment of a traumatizing event, but may contain different aspects of it. For instance, one of Sally's EPs experienced her father's sexual abuse, but without hearing associated unpleasant noises, while a second EP experienced the noises in the same moments of such traumatizing events. We have called this phenomenon parallel dissociation. Different EPs may also experience successive episodes of trauma over time, as when the first two of Sally's EPs experienced her father's advances, but a third one experienced the next event in time, the actual rape. We call this sequential dissociation. Types of parallel dissociation. Noyes and Coletti observed that in the face of mortal danger, we find individuals becoming observers of that which is taking place, effectively removing themselves from danger. Effectively, but not completely, we add, because one dissociative part continues to experience the traumatizing event as another part watches. Probably the simplest form of parallel disassociation during traumatization is this division between an EP that experiences the traumatic experience at sensory, motor, and affective levels, and experiencing EP, and an observation part of the personality that is subjectively out of body and looks upon the experiencing EP from afar, as though there is a spatial distance between the two. This is a well-documented phenomenon, previously described as a dissociation between an experience and an observing part of the ego. It has been reported by victims of childhood sexual abuse, combat veterans, and motor vehicle accident victims. The fact that motor vehicle accident victims this type of parallel dissociation indicates that people undergoing a single traumatic incident may also experience this basic type of parallel dissociation and thus develop a very simple and perhaps temporary form of secondary structural dissociation. Also, this is just me, but my take on this is that what they're talking about is like depersonalization, like feel like you're observing yourself like from like a dream or from the corner of the room or that kind of a thing. They're saying that that is just one of your EPs that is observing and that another part of you stayed embodied. Final quote from this chapter. Some EPs appear to be fixated in a hypervigilant defensive subsystem, and they can be easily mistaken for observing EPs. Hypervigilant parts do much more than merely passively observe. Their focus is exclusively on the environment, which they actively scan, looking for danger signals, and they often have a feeling of alarm or even fear. Generally, such hypervigilant parts are not observant of other parts of the personality. Some observing EPs seem to develop more secondary elaboration and appear highly intellectualized, non-feeling, but sometimes quite insightful parts of the personality, and have much more memory than only of traumatic experiences. A few do report feeling, but it is usually very limited and mild. As integration of the personality begins to occur, these parts generally develop more feeling and less psychological distance from their personal experiences. But until that time, they may recognize mental and behavioral actions of other parts and interpersonal relationships to a degree that is not present in other parts of the personality. Again, this is just my interpretation, but I think that's saying when you have a hypervigilant part, it tends to be an intellectualizer that really tends to not have a whole lot of feeling with it, but it can have better memory than other EP parts.